acknowledge that Equal Voice, our offices are located on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Their traditions and protocols continue to nurture this territory. We acknowledge the ongoing oppression of lands, cultures, and Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in what we now know as Canada, and we commit to the healing and decolonizing journey that we all need to share together. I myself am dialing in from the traditional lands of the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat people. So before we dive in, I'd like to give you a little bit of an overview of how we'll spend the time together. We have a lot to cover, so we'll do a bit of a background on the Modernizing Legislatures project that led us to being here today at this summit. After that, we'll hear from Abacus Data, who will be presenting results of an environmental scan that they conducted on hybrid features in the legislature. They'll also talk about some of the polling data that came out of a national poll that they did on this particular question. We'll take a pause then for some questions, and then we'll hear from our partners at Strategy Corp. Strategy Corp is an advisory firm that conducted the interviews on our behalf with key stakeholders, including clerks, House speakers, House leaders, to really dig deeper into the hybrid features that exist in our legislatures. To close the summit, what we'll do is open the floor for a broader question and answer session. Feel free to use the chat, and I hope you enjoy something out of the summit and learn a little bit more about our work at Equal Voice. And for those of you who don't know, Equal Voice is a charitable organization. We've been around for about 20 years, since 2001. We have extended our work into not just the federal parliament, but also looking at advocacy at the municipal and band council levels as well, because we want to see more women elected across all levels of government. One of the things that we love about Equal Voice is that we are actually multi-partisan, so we welcome all sides of the House, and we do our work through education, research, and focused projects such as this one. So let me turn to today's theme, modernizing legislatures. What does it really mean to be modernizing a legislature, and what do we need to be doing? Our surveys have shown that one reason that women might be disinterested in a career as an elected representative is that there's a bit of a misalignment with their own career goals. Some see that a career as an elected representative can offer good pay and benefits, but fewer see the opportunities around work-life balance. We know that often serving as an elected leader means feeling like you have to be on all the time and always available. And so what can we be doing to make public office and public life more appealing as a workplace? This is part of the question that we want to explore through the work in understanding how hybrid and adaptations around hybrid could support that. It's crazy that 4 years ago, we were all in the thick of the breakouts, in the lockdowns of COVID-19. And it has absolutely transformed the ways we all operate across this country. At the time, there was a lot of quick, rapid innovation and modernization. And we think that that work can continue to increase and advance women's leadership in decision-making systems across the country. This particular project, Modernizing Legislatures, is funded and supported through Women and Gender Equality, through the federal government, at the Government of Canada. And our focus here is to take a look at what we've learned from the pandemic to make our parliaments more gender-sensitive institutions. So some of the recent findings from Abacus Data indicate that hybrid features can foster inclusivity and increase the participation of women at all levels of government. And the results of the work done by Strategy Corp show that what's really required is political leadership and will to ensure that these solutions become kind of permanent fixtures in our systems. We know that these features, these hybrid elements, have the potential to address some of the systemic barriers that exist for women's participation in politics. So in some circumstances, in terms of childbirth or illness or family responsibilities or other exceptional circumstances, all of us are human, and we all need to want to be able to show up in our communities, and for our loved ones. And that sometimes means not being able to be physically present in the work. But if a CEO of a multinational can make high stakes decisions remotely, we think elected officials can as well. So in the context of this project, what we refer to as hybrid is about the ability for legislators and elected officials to participate virtually in proceedings when in person is not possible. It's not remote all the time. It's about that flexibility in the system. And it actually allows officials to also be anchored in their communities as well. So there's a lot there that we think of as really important in our system. So what I'd like to do now is to turn over to my colleague Oksana and invite her to share some of the insights and work that has come out of this project.
Let's share my screen, the classic share my screen line. And it looks like we're good to go. So hi everyone, my name is Oksana Kiszczak, and I'm the Director of Strategy and Insights at Abacus Data. I'm based in Ottawa and do a lot of our work with different organizations, looking at democracy and engagement, and of course working with Equal Voice on this project and other projects to understand sort of how women view participating in politics, how they can become bigger participants, and in this particular case, what hybrid parliaments look like for Canadians overall, but also for encouraging participation, including women and others, to get involved in politics. So just a few pieces of data that I'm going to share with you today. The full report will be available after this presentation, and encourage you to look at and dig deeper into more of the insights, but just some high level pieces to get us thinking this afternoon or morning, wherever you are joining us from. So the study was conducted in June of 2023, so last summer, when a lot of these discussions about hybrid parliament were happening at the federal level. We surveyed a good sample of Canadians, 18 plus, and an oversample of women as well, to understand their particular sort of interests or alignment with hybrid parliament and other things that might encourage them to study and join politics. The data was weighted to match Canada's population, despite the oversample, so any number that you see today is sort of representative of Canadians overall. So I'll move on past perhaps someone's favorite slide of the presentation and other folks' least favorite slide of the presentation, and we'll get into some of the actual data pieces here. So before we get into that question about what percentage of Canadians are supportive of these kinds of approaches to parliaments and legislatures, I want to set the stage a little bit. We wanted to understand beyond hybrid parliament where Canadians are coming from in their sort of understanding of what elected officials do. So first and foremost, I think it's important, and I think we need to give a nod to elected representatives here first, and that most Canadians say that their elected representatives work hard for the people they represent. So the intentions are there, regardless of how parliamentarians or MLAs or MPPs are showing up to the job. Folks are generally supportive that they trust the elected representative to be doing what they need to be done. We also were a little curious to understand sort of how Canadians thought elected representatives were splitting their time, and what sort of interest they had in if they could design an ideal sort of time schedule for their elected representatives, if they'd want them to spend time more so back in their riding or in Ottawa for the case of federal representatives. And so we see that most Canadians think that time is split about half and half right now. Half the time working from Ottawa, half the time working from their constituency. But when we ask them the ideal time spent in these two places, there's a bigger sort of interest in having more time spent working from constituency, so their communities, their ridings. And so this is sort of the first glimpse that Canadians are supportive of having the option for elected representatives to split their time a little differently, spend more time amongst the people that they represent. When we get straight into the numbers here, we see that support for a hybrid model of governing is high for a number of different levels of government. So first we asked about city council, 70% support, about a third say they oppose. Support looks similar across different areas. We can see that a commute might look a lot different for someone who's in a rural area versus a suburban area, but there's still strong levels of support throughout for each type of area. We also see that there's a high level of support for a hybrid model for provincial legislature. So 68% of Canadians across the board support. You can see it's sort of higher in BC, in Atlantic Canada, in prairie provinces, and then about a third for folks who are in Alberta, who are in Ontario, who are in Quebec. So overall, fairly level support across the country. And looking at the federal level, we see that 2/3 of Canadians support the hybrid model at this level as well. And you can see that support is fairly similar across the board as well, particularly high for individuals who are living in Atlantic Canada. This is perhaps due to sort of the commute involved with traveling from Atlantic Canada to Ottawa, and that folks are looking for their elected representatives to spend that time instead in the community, talking to individuals that they represent, talking to community groups, just spending less time on the road. We went a little bit step further and asked individuals, okay, let's say that there was something that was being proposed. The federal government was considering introducing a hybrid model. Would you want your MP to vote in favor or against this model? So kind of putting it from a hypothetical to a real life scenario. And what we found is that 43% said in favor, 27% against, and 31% said unsure. So fairly moderate levels of support, but a lot of that is due to people being unsure. And so we'll get into a little bit more of why sort of folks might be uncertain and sort of the pieces that they're looking to make sure are sort of dealt with if we move to this different model. We were curious to understand sort of the circumstances that individuals thought hybrid should be used. So you can see that support for these reasons is a lot higher than that vote question. So I think a lot of people's support is sort of couched in understanding of when a hybrid model is to be used and how it is to be used. And overall, when we sort of put these specific pieces to folks, they're very, very supportive, even more so than that general question. You can see that very supportive of hybrid model in the event of an illness, in the event of a natural disaster or emergency event, caregiving for a loved one, being a new parent or expecting a child. Also very high levels of support, saying this is a good reason to have that flexibility for our elected representatives to maybe not travel to Ottawa just as much, so that they can split their time and they can tend to their other responsibilities, whether it be family responsibilities or something like an event in their constituency. A good number of folks say that that's a good reason to stay in their riding and participate in the legislature from there. Looking into those pros and cons a little bit more, we see that 81% of Canadians say for elected representatives, a hybrid work environment creates more work-life balance. So a lot of those conversations that she was alluding to about why Canadians and women might not want to take on an elected representative role is that work-life balance puzzle and that piece. And so strong majority of Canadians say that this hybrid work environment is really supportive of that work-life balance that many women are seeking if they were to run to become an elected representative. We also see that 2/3 of Canadians say that this type of model would be a more inclusive workplace for an elected representative. So that means having more diversity in our legislatures and our parliaments, and then also sort of more inclusivity in the conversation and collecting different viewpoints. Other benefits that we found were a lot, as you can see. Folks were really interested in seeing sort of different benefits. The first and foremost was that that travel and time commitment piece. So a lot of folks said that reducing the time and cost of travel is a really big benefit of hybrid parliament. Folks are also interested in the reduction of carbon emissions. If elected representatives don't have to take as many planes or whatever other way they use to commute. That's better on our environment. That work-life balance piece, again, you can see is right at the top of the list as another really big benefit to having a hybrid parliament. But also, as you can see, there's a lot of other sort of nuances in the middle of that list there. There's allowing MPs to better serve their constituents. Well over half say that that's a benefit. Attracting a more diverse group of people to run for office. Also there, allowing MPs to serve a more diverse group of constituents, also on the list. And worth noting that over half of Canadians say that this model would make Parliament more inclusive for women specifically. So a number of benefits, from everything from cost to environmental to just better representing Canadians and better including Canadians in our democracy. I think one of the most telling sort of pieces is this stat right here. So 2/3 of Canadians believe that the hybrid model would mean their MP could do a better job of representing them and their needs. We already know that folks say that they do a good job of these pieces, but as you may know, and I'm sure from personal experience, you're always looking for your elected representative to represent your needs and do as good of a job as they can with that. And 2/3 of Canadians say that a hybrid model would allow them to do this even better. Now, of course, there are some concerns that individuals have, and we wanted to explore these as well to understand that when these models are being created and designed, that we're aware and attuned to the concerns that Canadians may have to try and mitigate these a little bit more as these systems are being designed. And so one of the sort of main concerns folks have is that not all elected representatives will be heard equally. And along the same vein, folks are concerned that their elected representative will be less present with a remote option. And so I think that a lot of these types of concerns are really based on the how this is designed, making sure that folks have a voice whether they're in the room physically or not, and participation is encouraged for both types of participants equally. The other sort of pieces that folks have concerns with are that their voice might not be able to be heard if representatives are working remote. So sort of along those lines of that disconnect, I think that's really about designing a system in which folks who are both remote and in person are heard to the same degree. And along those lines, there's some concerns about technology, making sure that the technology that is used, that is implemented is correct and allows all individuals around the table to be heard equally. One of the last pieces of data that I'll share here that I think is really encouraging is that we also asked folks, okay, if hybrid was an option, would you be more or less likely to consider running yourself? And what we found was that, there we go, wrong order of the slides there. But what we found was that 61% of Canadians said they'd be more likely to run if hybrid was an option. So that's a large number of Canadians who say that they might be all the way along the spectrum of I'm not interested at all, but it's pushing 61% of Canadians along that line to consider running. And that's, I think, a really good number. If we look at it by different demographics, we can see that it's 57% among women, so slightly lower, but still over half of women are more likely to consider running for office if hybrid is an option. That's big. That's a lot of women in Canada. Among folks who identify themselves as a visible minority, 69%. So nearly 7 in 10 individuals who say they identify as a visible minority would be more likely to run with a hybrid model. So again, some really positive numbers for groups that might not always be represented right now. And I think one of the sort of most important numbers is we asked folks where they sort of sit on this scale of likelihood to run. So there was never, I'm not interested. There were folks who are like, yes, sign me up, I'm waiting for the next election. And then there's a healthy chunk in the middle who are sort of on the fence about things, and they sort of need something to tip the scales a little bit and bring them to become more interested. And what we found was among this group, 88% of them said that if hybrid was an option, they'd be more likely to run. And so I think this is, again, one of the most important numbers, is that we're not going to get every Canadian to run for office, and that's not realistic, and probably not something that would be helpful with the very long list on when you go to vote at the ballot box. But for folks that are on that path to consider running for office, this is something nearly 90% of them say that if hybrid was an option, it would tip the scales for them and they would sign up. So some really good pieces there. So I'll leave it at that, leave those data pieces with you, and I'll pass it back to Chi. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Oksana. I know that took a peek through the list of attendees who are on the call, and there are lots of folks there who care deeply about democracy and our political infrastructure. I'm wondering if there's any questions from the audience. Feel free to use the Q&A. We've got a few moments before we turn over to some of the consultation work that Strategy Core led. And if not, I want to ask a little bit about some of the environmental scan work that you did. One of the jurisdictions you took a look at was Scotland. I wanted to know if there's any insights from that context that you think are helpful for us in our conversation today.
Yeah, so we did sort of that big environmental scan. Scotland was one of those countries that's a little bit sort of further along, and just trying to connect a lot of the pieces that Canadians identified in the survey with the model there. I think there's a lot of interest in taking that sort of inclusivity lens to the conversation, and also geographic lens. Folks who are sort of further away from Ottawa are more supportive of a hybrid model for a number of reasons, travel and cost being one of them, but they know that their elected representatives have a lot of time in the air or time traveling, and folks are really looking to make sure that their representatives are serving them to the best of their abilities. And that's just sort of one of the ways that they're looking to see that and see hybrid as a solution for that.
Thanks so much, Oksana. I know some of those numbers are really affirming for me as somebody who's championing changes to the system, is that Canadians are happy to see us think about modest and bigger and infrastructure changes that might allow for our parliaments to be more accommodating and more reflective of where we are today. You know, we are deeply now in the 21st century, and some of the changes that weren't imaginable pre-COVID are now things that are in the mix and are deeply considered as new ways of working, and politics should also be in the mix of that. I'm not seeing, there is a question for a request for the email. Oh, and someone's already, Oksana, you've already jumped on it.
Yes.
For those who want to go deeper and might have further questions on the polling data, I am not a polling expert, but Oksana and her team are. So feel free to take a look at the report that is available on our website and dive deeper into the numbers if you happen to love numbers the way Oksana's team does. So a question from Lloyd Axworthy: does hybrid have a particular advantage for Indigenous women? It's a great question. I don't think our sample size spoke to that, but Oksana, do you want to weigh in and then?
Yeah, so our sample size wasn't sort of large enough to dive into that particular group, but what I can say is looking at sort of women that might have other systemic barriers more generally, and they're sort of put themselves in that group of where they might be more open or more likely, or feel they're more likely to experience things like harassment or unable to balance or unable to have the support from the network. That's something that's really big as well, that hybrid is an option for them, and then they sort of see those benefits as sort of being another tool in their toolbox to be able to become an elected representative.
That's a great question. So there's a question about this information, whether or not we're sharing this directly to each of the legislatures, and that's a great one that Dania can kind of speak to. So I think if there's no other questions on the polling data, we'll move to the conversation of the consultation process, so that we can share a little bit about that part of the work. And over to you, Dania.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, my name is Dania Verret, and I am a vice president at Strategy Corp. I'm joining from the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. I work with a lot of nonprofits and social purpose organizations who are working on progressive policies for their communities. So it's really great to be working with Equal Voice on this project. Our focus was on understanding the status and experience of hybrid mechanisms across the country. So we did this through consultations with elected and administrative officials at legislatures from coast to coast to coast. So we'll go to the next slide here. Thank you. I'll keep talking. So we focused our work on clerks, government house leaders, and speakers. And you'll see on the next slide here that we had two objectives for our consultations. The first was to, one more part, there we go. The first was to identify the available hybrid mechanisms for the modernizing legislatures and understand where and how hybrid options could work within that. And the second was to solicit insights and inputs on potential solutions and opportunities to make hybrid participation a feature of legislatures moving forward. So as of now, we've heard from representatives of 12 provinces and territories and the federal government. And so the Northwest Territories is still outstanding. You can see the breakdown here on the slide for who we spoke with. Just a note on the numbers, often there would be discussions amongst the three different individuals in their offices within a jurisdiction regarding who would speak with us. And oftentimes they recommended that we primarily focus on the clerk, given the proximity to the actual administrative implementation of hybrid options. So the following slides are going to provide a high-level overview of what we heard. And given the time that we have, I'm just going to keep it fairly general, if that's okay. There's a lot that we heard and a lot to unpack. So here, given the leadership role, as I said, on the administrative running of the legislatures, the clerks were able to provide a more detailed overview of sort of the presence of hybrid and the evolution of hybrid mechanisms prior to the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, some legislatures allowed for committees to meet via teleconference or by video conference and allowed witnesses to present their testimony in the same way. In a select few jurisdictions, cabinet proceedings were able to take place with hybrid participation prior to the pandemic. But it's very important to note that there was no legislative assembly in Canada that provided for mechanisms to allow elected officials to participate in either debates or the orders of the day of their legislatures in a virtual setting prior to the pandemic. So during the pandemic, obviously everything changed, and each legislature had to make decisions on how they were going to adapt to respect public health measures within their particular context. So many legislatures did adopt hybrid measures. Several jurisdictions and some members participate virtually, with a small number in the chamber, and some held committees proceedings fully virtually. However, the majority of legislatures continue to operate in person with measures such as masking, physical distancing, plastic shielding, and other steps to comply with public health guidelines. There was a plurality of legislatures that allowed for members to attend virtually if they were sick, but they did expect in-person attendance otherwise. It's important to note here that there are a variety of procedural regulations used to enable hybrid mechanisms, and it varies greatly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So they really were operating within their own context within their legislatures, to not just technically and functionally, but within their own orders, their own proceedings. So on balance, many legislative assemblies passed sessional orders enabling the participation of members virtually in certain circumstances. And there were two main categories. So jurisdictions either amended their standing orders altogether to enable hybrid, which is what happened in the House of Commons, or they passed motions on a case-by-case basis to allow for a member who was sick to participate virtually. That happened in Nova Scotia, as an example. So as it stands today, we're out of the high point of the pandemic, and legislatures transitioned back to in-person proceedings. Some of the procedural mechanisms have reverted to pre-pandemic practices, but there are hybrid components in different aspects of the legislature activities that are still enabled in most jurisdictions across Canada. Members are expected to participate in person unless they have approval from their whip to attend virtually for health or other reasons. Jurisdictions did make the decisions to purchase the technology to enable hybrid, so the capability still exists there. We also discussed with clerks their experience with the implementation of the hybrid mechanisms, and two things were really clear. So the first one is implementing technology-enabled mechanisms to enable hybrid or virtual were easy when they had clear direction or support from political decision makers. And so that clarity was really important in order to say, okay, now we will move forward and figure out how to ensure that the proceedings of the legislature can continue smoothly. The second thing is more from a change management perspective. As with any organization, there were challenges of cost with HR, with technical understanding, but these were not actually significant barriers to the implementation of the hybrid mechanisms. And on cost in particular, many interviewees said that their focus was on the continued running of the legislature. So the considerations of cost were made in a different framework. One, the legislatures had to continue, so there was an imperative to do this, but also you could repurpose budgets from or repurpose funding from other areas of the budget that were not being used, such as travel. So it wasn't necessarily that much of an added cost, it was just a different type of cost. So if we move to the next slide, we'll just talk a bit about the speakers and the House leaders here. So they provided more context on the experience sort of within the legislature, and 4 key areas emerge. So I'm just going to speak to a different lengths to each of them, but there's a clear recognition of the need for in-person sittings as a baseline. So often speakers noted the importance of fostering collegiality, productivity, and personal relationships, and the role that played in improving the quality of legislation stemming from these elements. The second, and this is like really where a lot of the conversation should be, is there's a strong sense of duty for elected and Senate officials to attend the assembly in person and to be seen to attend the assembly in person. So the expectation of most members and their constituents, which you can see from some of the polling, is that the duty of an elected representative is to attend the proceedings of the legislature in person, and that is a key part of fulfilling their responsibilities to their constituents. You can see here, we've got this quotation from one speaker that said, being an elected official is not just a job, it's a commitment. We sacrifice a lot to get to the assembly. It's a privilege to participate. We want and have to be there. And that sort of mental piece is a really important part of what hybrid and other modernizing pieces of the legislature could look like moving forward. So the third piece is that the location, size, and context of a jurisdiction's legislature is a major factor of hybrid needs. So provinces and territories with a smaller number of members in their legislative assemblies, such as PEI, which is 27 MLAs, or Nunavut, which is 22 MLAs, they were less inclined to pivot to hybrid measures because they could use physical distancing and other COVID safety measures because of the small number of elected officials. It also did allow, the smaller number did allow for a smoother transition to hybrid measures when they did make that decision to partially implement hybrid. Yukon is an example of a small legislature. It has 19 MLAs and there's a minority government. So the absence of an MLA could lead to potentially the government losing a vote or even bringing down the government. So hybrid measures there could, considerations there could improve the resiliency of government because there wouldn't be the potential of losing power just because of an illness or a personal emergency that doesn't allow for being there physically in person, but could allow for some sort of hybrid virtual participation. Connectivity obviously is important in the Northern Territories, particularly in Nunavut, where the internet is solely through satellite. It makes it difficult and less efficient to use hybrid measures. There was also some concern that the size of a territory or province could lead to policymakers that are closer to the location of the legislature and more likely to attend in person could build coalitions or gain greater influence if there was a hybrid environment and there were people who were continually self-selecting not to participate in person. The last piece here is that there's a sense that hybrid was a necessary option to have based on circumstances, but not as the norm. So House leaders were much more supportive of more permanent and codified hybrid models for legislatures, rather than speakers who have a different engagement with policymakers within the chambers that they're actually presiding over. However, these speakers did recognize that there is a place for hybrid mechanisms in our legislative assemblies to be used as needed and not, as we said, maintained as a norm regularly. In our interviews, if you go to the next slide, one of the main themes that came up repeatedly, and you can hear it in some of the feedback that I just shared, was the challenge in defining hybrid. This was true both for defining hybrid for technical implementation within the proceedings of the legislature. So what are the bounds of it? But also for how it's used in conversation politically. In that political conversation about hybrid mechanisms, the term is often sort of wrongly associated with fully remote working, right? Like either everyone is fully remote, or I as an individual will always be online as opposed to in person. And, you know, when the entire legislature might be fully remote, or an individual might be fully remote while others are fully in person, there's a lot of conflation of that with hybrid. So when we're talking about hybrid and we define this and refined our definition as we talked with the different interviewees, we mean a legislature where a hybrid option can be available for legislators in specific circumstances such as illness, pregnancy, caregiving responsibilities, or extraordinary circumstances to provide legislatures with the tools they need to fully represent their constituents during votes and other important legislative businesses when in-person participation is not possible. So we know that there are benefits to being in person at the legislatures. We also know that a sense of duty to attend in person is an important obstacle to expanding and scaling up hybrid mechanisms. So moving forward, the definition of hybrid and education about it is going to be really important to help people understand that the concept doesn't go against the expectations of the duties of an elected official. Go to the next slide. We just pulled together an overview of the common benefits and challenges of hybrid that we heard from all three of the groups that we interviewed. So on the benefits here, I'm not going to go through each and every one of them, but I do want to talk about a few examples. So on the first benefit, which is enables greater participation and accessibility for policymakers and staff, you know, several interviewees remarked how hybrid options inherently support greater gender equality and participation in Canada's lawmaking process. One government house leader noted that in 2021, 4 elected officials in the legislature gave birth, and they were still able to participate fully as elected officials due to the introduction of hybrid measures. The next one's really interesting. On increasing policymaker capacity, there was actually significant when it came to the multiple duties that, previous slide, sorry, the multiple duties that a policymaker can hold. So one example that we heard from Nunavut is their lack of hybrid options actually prevented the Premier from attending the FPT Premier's meeting due to a commitment to attending the legislature in person. So had Nunavut had hybrid mechanisms in place, the Premier could have fulfilled both the duty to the legislature and the duty as part of Canada's federated system, rather than being unable to take its seat at that table among fellow premiers. Another one is the greater capacity for witnesses and speakers. And we know that with more virtual options for witnesses in legislative proceedings, we would have more voices able to participate in discussions of legislation, because the length of time it takes to travel and the cost of travel wouldn't be a factor in that same way. So there is less of a barrier to entry for those who might participate as witnesses in committee proceedings. So under the challenges of hybrid, this first one's interesting. So different decorum when it comes to a hybrid environment. There were 2 perspectives here on the impacts. On the one hand, many interviews felt there was a loss of the human experience within legislative proceedings when there is a hybrid option, because people are not able to engage on the sidelines with members of other caucuses, and that entrenches ideological or political positions. But on the other hand, some officials interviewed felt that online participation actually improved decorum, particularly in moments of debate, such as, or a question period, because you couldn't really heckle. And if you tried to say something and you were unmuted, your face popped up there. Everyone knows that it's you who's doing it. So there are different elements there, but I will say that this notion of a loss of a human experience within the legislative proceedings, because you're not meeting on the margins, again, if you look at hybrid as a when necessary option, as opposed to this expectation that people will be using it all of the time, then the argument for that actually diminishes because it's on an as needed basis as opposed to being the norm. Another one that you can't deny is technical challenges. Obviously, connectivity is an issue. There's lost time from, muted speakers who have to go unmute and bad connections. But also it's difficult to get smooth interpretation for virtual participants, particularly in jurisdictions that have, such as Nunavut, which is 3 official languages, or places like the federal House of Commons and the Senate, where it's English and French. And then the last piece here is really about that public perspectives of not attending, which we talked about earlier, but it really is a challenge that you have to get over, this feeling that if you aren't in person, you aren't working. So just move to the last slide here. So, clerks, government house leaders, and speakers also provided us with interesting suggestions for next steps legislators could look to pursue with respect to expanding hybrid mechanisms and also modernizing legislatures in general. So, the most common was the need for consensus and codification of a viable hybrid model in the legislatures. And to do that, you need to amend the standing orders versus allowing for hybrid on a sessional or ad hoc basis. But as you have heard from the presentation so far, the greatest challenge here is political will and political discussion to confirm that consensus. And you really need to overcome it before you get into the technical pieces. One speaker said to us, there is not a lot of agreement on the appropriate circumstances in which hybrid should be allowed. Other ideas for putting boundaries on hybrid include setting a minimum number of policymakers required to be physically in the chamber at a certain time unless there is a pandemic or an emergency. Another is a set number of hybrid days per year, like vacation or sick days. Another is organizing rotating groups within caucuses to attend the assembly in person. And we saw that in Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, these were larger legislatures that used separating or creating smaller caucus into groups for voting or attendance. Newfoundland and Labrador also did this. But we also heard from a few different jurisdictions, it would be nice if a member was ill and unable to vote in key moments that perhaps the opposing party would select a member of their own to sit out for the same vote in order to seek some equality in opportunity there. Again, those boundaries do require negotiation among House leaders in order to provide direction for the speaker to feel comfortable to provide direction to the clerk in order to implement those pieces. So just in the end, in addition to the conversation about hybrid mechanisms, many of our interviewees noted other initiatives that legislatures could take to modernize, including expanding supports for childcare, updating harassment policies, and just improving supports and rules to ensure that assemblies are safe and inclusive spaces for all. So that was a lot, and that barely gives you an indication of a lot of the tremendous feedback that we received, and I'm happy to answer questions.
We've got our first question in the chat, which is which jurisdictions are using remote voting apps? I don't know if Dania, if you've got that list handy.
I don't have that list handy, but we can absolutely share that. I will make a note of that.
And another question we've received is around a sort of gender difference between female identified or male identified clerks, speakers, House leaders. So are there gender differences on moving towards hybrid legislatures, or has the sample, was there anything there that pointed to sort of different views?
I would say that there wasn't a tremendous difference. I think that there are, for instance, many, male presenting clerks, speakers, House leaders who see the value of all of this, even if the stereotype of who might use it, they do not fit that. We've noted that there are many examples of of men, quite honestly, who are using hybrid options, just from our basic observations of the operations of different legislatures. For instance, some members who were able to be, some male members who were able to be with the dying parent in their last days because they were able to participate virtually for that confined period of time. I will say that, perhaps those who are of childbearing age may have a different perspective of it. Obviously, for the ability to deploy that will also to continue to be a comprehensive representative. I'd say, though, that on the whole, from an intellectual perspective, everyone gets it that there is value in hybrid. It's really about ensuring that there's political consensus in order to move it forward, and what the restrictions are within their legislatures in order to get that done. And I will say the clerks as well. The clerks as well are very clear that they are focused on, once they receive direction, they are the ones to implement. And so I'd say that they were less open to sharing their views, rightly so, because of their roles.
So I've got a few more questions popping up in the Q&A. Thank you, folks. Wondering if there was any examination of municipalities or First Nation councils in this work. I can take that one. The scope of the work the strategy core focused on was the provincial level. We are working with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to do a similar sort of exploration, and that work is underway at the moment, but have not expanded out the question to First Nations councils. And there's a follow-up question as well about whether or not there are international models that we should be looking to that could inform how we kind of pick up this work.
I know that Oksana mentioned the landscape review that they did. I do note that there were a few international jurisdictions that House speakers, that speakers, government House leaders, and clerks did mention. One of them was the UK as well. But I think that there's a greater understanding of looking to get, it's not best practices just yet because everyone is still very early in this, but the individual experiences of how things worked. I think there's a greater information sharing going on about that.
We've got another question that I think is probably about this part of the research, but maybe more relevant for the data sets about the age split and the impact on results. It wasn't a huge qualitative interview sample, so I don't know that we did a lot of slicing and dicing from that perspective. I don't, Dania, want to add there?
We did not, and to be honest, a lot of it is relative to also the political background of the individual that you're talking to, or the political versus non-political role that they played. I would say that, again, there's a general sense that everyone understands the benefit of hybrid. It's really about implementation and getting over that hump of political will.
Yeah, if I can just jump in here on that as well for the data set. There is more support for a hybrid model for younger Canadians compared to older to some degree. But I think sort of what Dania is saying is it's a lot about the how and the why it's implemented and when it should be used. I think a lot of that is coming from comfort of using technology for maybe their own jobs or experiences, just communicating with, building a community and sort of feeling comfortable participating online. But overall support is still strong among all different age groups that we looked at.
So there's another question in the chat about the definition of hybrid that we landed on in the discussion here, how it works in provinces and territories if it doesn't reflect the House of Commons.
It does not. I think that in many of the provinces and territories, consideration for the virtual component of hybrid participation is often focused mainly on if you are personally sick. And I think, again, that's where the boxing in of the challenge is, that there are many other reasons why it might prevent someone from participating, whether that's travel, whether that's, a multitude of responsibilities at the same time within your constituency and at the legislature, or like, your plane gets canceled or your train gets canceled and things like that. And so there isn't. However, we found that in discussions, there is a desire for, as I said before, a greater definition of hybrid to push back against the notion of remote, like remote only.
Next question, and this is probably best for Dania. In the conversations, what were the limitations around technology solutions, whether or not that was a bit of a barrier for any of the jurisdictions thinking about moving forward?
So, like I said, they all purchased, for the most part, the technology, and cost was not as much of a consideration because they had to keep the legislatures running. There were some legislatures that were older. Obviously, like the physical buildings were older, and it makes the technology-enabled mechanisms a little harder to implement as opposed to a newer building. And so there were some tech challenges, but there was a lot of sort of, passion and go get it attitude to make it work. You had to make it work because things had to move forward. The legislature had to continue moving forward. And so a common theme that we heard was the technology exists. We have the technology. It's really, from the clerk's perspective, they need the direction from the political side simply to move forward with it. And there are always improvements and iterations, but this concept of the technology doesn't exist to support it, that's actually not what we heard from particularly the clerks. There may be some challenges with things like remote, and rural connectivity, but overall, the technology exists to support shifting to hybrid. It's really about the support systems around it to make sure that that technology is able to be deployed.
Yeah, and I do think about that rural piece and bandwidth for some folks, but not all. But it is a real question and things that we need to continue to invest in terms of our broader national infrastructure.
And I will say there is also, clerks mentioned, the need, and some speakers too, like the need to provide training to members of all ages on how to use the technology itself.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine also some culture pieces around, you talked a bit about the decorum and how people show up virtually is going to look different than how you show up in person. So those are considerations as well. We have another question about environmental and sustainability benefits. We know that when the federal government went ahead to adopt hybrid, that they talked about some of those benefits, but wondering if this showed up in Oksana's data. Dania, if you heard a piece of that, of course, federally for folks who are traveling those big distances, there are changes around carbon footprint that could be associated.
And Oksana, do you want to go? I've been talking a lot.
I'll be really quick. So yes, that was something that folks identified. We put on the list as potential benefits, and they did rise to the top of the list. So about 3/4 of Canadians said that hybrid parliament federally would have a positive impact on carbon emissions. So that sort of less emissions, less travel piece. So it's definitely something that is on the list for Canadians, and they're sort of thinking about this holistically beyond just participation, but what other benefits can we see from a hybrid model?
And practically within the legislatures, the shift to implement technology-enabled mechanisms to allow the proceedings to continue, again, were made during a very different period in time where if they were, let's say, 5 years ago, looking to see whether they should implement hybrid options, I do think that environmental concerns would have played a part in it. However, there wasn't much travel back then. or during the pandemic, but they had to swiftly make the shift to implementing hybrid mechanisms. And so I don't think the initial piece was health and safety and continued participation of elected officials in their duties within the legislatures. And so the conversation moving forward about how do we embed even more hybrid mechanisms to the current, legislatures, provincial, territorial, alongside the federal, where it is. That will be a part of the conversation, I would expect. Obviously different for larger jurisdictions and for smaller jurisdictions. But that, I think will continue to be secondary to this political will piece and this sort of the mental gymnastics that you have to make to go to accept that if you're not, just because you're not in Parliament, 3 times during the year when the session is sitting or when the House or legislatures are sitting, it means that you're not working, right? And so I think we have to get over that piece and build in the other proof points for the value of hybrid, but you still got to get through that first hurdle.
This is a good segue to the next question, which was just probing a bit on the 4 elected officials who gave birth in 2021, and were those all Canadian baby births to parliaments?
Yes.
There's one final question. I know we're nearly at the end of our time, and I'm so thrilled that folks had such great questions. Are there any examples of legislatures that maintain hybrid against the wishes of some parties? I don't know if we've got the answer for that in our back pocket.
I mean, the federal example where the Conservatives pushed against it, were not in support of it, is a prime example right there. But in terms of smaller hybrid measures, nothing has obviously gone as far as the federal House of Commons. And so I think the discussions about the hybrid pieces, while the broad discussion is a big one, I don't know that there are that people are upset if there is a virtual component to allow witnesses to testify at committee.
Thank you. Last question. About whether or not there are any disruptions or hacking possibilities or security questions, or do the IT specialists in each of those jurisdictions, are they able to manage through that?
I don't recall it being that big of a factor. Again, there was a lot of testing of this before it actually went live. And so in that first bit of the pandemic, legislatures were still meeting in person how they could with public health measures being followed. So I don't have the answer to that off the top of my head, but we can share.
Thank you. We are just about to close our time together today. I want to thank everyone who dialed in to listen to some of the findings, both from the polling research as well as the scan and the in-depth interviews and the qualitative conversations from across the country. This is not our only conversation around this topic. We will be hosting a similar session on February 29th for elected officials. So, reaching out back to them in order to ensure that they know what's coming. We also have a session coming up on February 20th that we're hosting with Public Legal Education Action Center about sexual harassment and the opportunities to kind of move forward on sexual harassment in provincial legislatures coming up on Tuesday. The details for these upcoming events are going to be available on our website. We'll be sharing out the video for those who missed it and didn't get a chance to tune in, and really appreciate everyone's thoughtful questions here. We are ambitiously trying to reimagine our political systems so that they are places that people want to show up and do the work and serve all Canadians. And we're really grateful for this conversation and diving into something that is very technical, but has real implications on attracting quality candidates to political office. Thanks for your time, and take care and enjoy whatever winter weather you're experiencing today.